This month we're going to foundation piece the church. So you had the paper the first time we did foundation piecing that talked about what was in your kit. You have the foundation this time. You have a large blue piece that is your background. Then we have the white, which is the main part of the church. The brown, which is the roof and the door. And then this blue with a pattern in it that's for the windows. Now, I've shown you how to do foundation piecing two different ways. You are welcome to choose whichever method you prefer. I'm not going to go over them again, so whichever method you prefer, you need to copy your foundation pattern either onto foundation paper or onto freezer paper. I've pieced all my sections for the church. Now this is a 5-part pattern, so we're just making one block, but there's 5 parts to it. The door is part A, and part A gets sewn to part B, which is the window section, so on the side like that. Once that's sewn together, we have A, B, and then C gets sewn to the top of that, and then D to the top of that, and E to the top of that to give us our finished block. Now our matching points are going to be in here, and also probably right here. I think the steeple is going to come down right into the point, so that's where you're going to want to really pay attention. Here's my finished church block. It should be 8.5 inches high and 7.5 inches wide at this point. Now, if you want to, you can just be finished here for this month, but if you would like, you can go ahead and sew all your paper pieced sections together. Now, let me go over this because we can get in trouble if we follow the directions in the pattern. So, and what I'm showing you is the order that's in the pattern, but these can be shuffled however you want. They do not have to be in this order. It just has to equal 30.5 inches when we're finished. So down on the far left is the tree that is 3 parts. And all of these pieces should be 8.5 inches high. If any of yours are taller than that, you will need to trim them down. If all of them are shorter than that, you want a consistent height. It's not going to make a big difference if they were all like 8.25 high, but you do want them all to be the same height. So down on the far left, I have the tree that has 3 triangles in it. This one should measure unfinished 3 inches wide and is the 8.5 inches high. Then the silo, it should be 2 inches wide and 8.5 inches high. Then we have the barn, and if you added the 2-inch, I think it was 2 inches, yep, the 2-inch wide filler strip, and it was too tall, don't ease that in. You're going to want to cut it off to 8.5. If you added your 2-inch strip to your barn, then this piece should be right now 8 inches wide and 8.5 high. Then we have the single triangle tree, and that one should be 3 inches wide and again 8.5 inches tall. And I already talked about the church, but at this point it is 7.5 inches wide, 8.5 inches tall. Then we have the tree that is 5 triangles. If you added the 2-inch filler strip, and again, she made it too long. If you added the 2-inch filler strip and you need to cut it off to 8.5 inches high, this piece would be 4.5 inches wide, unfinished. And then next we go to the house. The house is 4.5 inches wide, and then we added a filler strip on top of it, which may have made it too tall. If it did, cut it down so the whole block is 8.5 inches high. Finally, we have the woven pine tree, which is 2.5 inches wide. And it also needs to be 8.5 high. It was in the foundation, so it should be fine. Now, if you have been doing the math on the width, it went 3 inches. If we subtract out our seam allowances, it would be 2.5 inches, 2 inches, 7.5 inches, 2.5 inches, 7 inches, 4 inches, 4 inches, and 2 inches. And then we would add our 1/2 inch seam back, so 1/4 inch on each end. If you were adding that up, it comes to 31.5 inches, which means it is too long. We need it to be 30.5 inches, so we need to take out an inch somewhere. So the place to do that is going to be on these filler strips. So there's two of them. There's the one on the tree with the 5 triangles, and there's the one on the barn. Now, if your blocks all came out exactly the way they were supposed to, you can go ahead and trim 1/2 of an inch off of each of those filler strips. However, if you're finding that your seams are ending up with your pieces too small, what I would suggest is sew together everything except for where the filler strips join. So I would leave this seam undone, and then when I got down here I would leave this seam undone. Then I would take my measurement again and see if I still need to take 1/2 an inch off. Once you're sure you've got it, then you can go ahead and trim whatever extra you have on your filler strips. However we get there, we need it to be 30.5 inches. When I was telling you the measurements of all my units before I went off to sew, I forgot one step at the end. I forgot to add my 1/2 inch seam allowance back in. So rather than it coming up to 31.5, it came up to 32, which means I have 1.5 inches too much. But at this point, I have just sewn this row together into 3 sections. So I have my barn and my tree, which, oh sorry, let me go back. My barn and my tree, and I measured it now, and the unfinished size is 12.5, so my finished is 12. Remember, you got to take out that 1/2 inch, the 1/4 inch for each side to come up with your finished size. Then my church with the 2 trees, it measures 14 inches, so that means that the finished size is going to be 13.5. And finally, my house with a tree came out to 6.5 inches wide, which means it's 6. So if I add my 12, my 13.5, and my 6, I come up with 31.5, but I still need to add back in my 1/4 inch seam allowance on each end, which brings me to 32 inches. And remember, I only need 30.5, so I need to trim off 1.5 inches. I'm going to do it one spacer at a time, even though mine is pretty accurate. So 1.5 inches divided by 2 spacers means I need to take 3/4 of an inch off. So I'm going to go ahead and take it off the barn and then sew that piece to the church and then come back and double check my measurements. I have now double, triple, quadruple checked my measurements. My piece now that's the barn and the church with 3 trees on it is 25.25 inches unfinished. So if I subtract the 1/2 inch out of it to get my finished size, that's 24.75. My house and my tree is 6.5 inches. If I subtract the 1/2 inch out of it, then that is 6 inches. So that leaves me with 30.75 finished, and I need to add the 1/2 inch back into it, so that would be 31.25. So to get to my 30.5, I need to take another 3/4 of an inch off, so I will go ahead and take it off here. Your measurements may be different, so you just need to do the math so that the row is going to come out to 30.5 inches unfinished when you get done sewing everything together. My row is sewn together, and it does come out to 30.5 inches. Okay, so for pressing, I'll flip this over and start down here, and this is the silo end. Both seams that are up against the silo get pressed in toward it because that's the path of least resistance. Then we come down on the other end of the barn, that gets pressed toward the spacer, and the triangle tree, that seam also gets pressed toward the spacer. The church, I pressed toward the triangle tree because there are fewer seams in the triangle tree. And then over here between the tall tree that has the 5 triangles in it and the church, I pressed toward the church because there are fewer seams in that. On the other side of that tree, I pressed toward the spacer. The house, I pressed toward the spacer. It looks like I need to go back and press again, but the braided tree, I pressed toward the house. The last step on this row is to remove the foundations. And I've mentioned it before, this is my least favorite part, is taking the paper out. If you use freezer paper anywhere, all you have to do is lift it and pull it off. That's the nice one. Where you stitch through the paper, I like to use a seam ripper or a stiletto or a really heavy duty pin. With the seam ripper, I'm running the back of it along my stitching lines because I'm perforating the paper that way. and then I get up under it and peel it off. And that's how you take the paper off. So just a reminder, the only thing you have to have finished for homework in October is the church. But if you want to go ahead and sew your row together, then you're just that much closer to finished with the quilt.